Hi, I'm Eric from Simply Elegant Home Cooking. Today I'm going to show you my recipe for homemade beef stock, also known as bone broth. This is a very important recipe. I use homemade stocks to make really high-end soups, stews, and sauces, and I'm going to show you some very simple steps. If you follow the steps exactly as I'm going to lay them out in this video, they're not difficult, and you can ensure that you get a very high quality stock. And you'll notice mine is a solid at room temperature. You know, it should have a gelatinous consistency just like that if you do it right. So I'm going to show you how to do it. This is going to blow away anything you can buy in the store. You follow this recipe, you're never going to want to buy a store-bought stock again, so stick around and I'll show you how it's done. Okay, so here we have our beef bones that we're going to use today in the stock. So I have a little bit more than 6 pounds of assorted bones in these wrapped packages. And in addition to the bones, and this is very important, I have about 1 pound of beef stew meat. This is just really important. You want to use a little bit of just plain beef in addition to the bones, because that's going to add some delicious flavor to your stock. Okay, and I've taken all of the bones out of their packaging. I've blotted everything dry, both the bones as well as the stew meat. Blotted it dry with paper towels, which is really important. And I should also note, I'm using pasture-raised, grass-fed beef. You don't have to do that. The recipe will work even with the regular beef. But if you use grass-fed, in addition to being delicious, this recipe is also very healthy. Now, I see some beef stock recipes that skip this step, but in my opinion, this is a necessary step. Anytime you make beef stock, we're going to roast the bones. So I have the oven preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to add just a very small amount of a neutral oil. Now, you don't need much, just add a little bit of drizzle of a neutral flavored oil. And I'm just adding that so nothing sticks to the pan. I'm just going to add it on, kind of move everything around, massage it a bit with my hands. And what this is going to do, we're going to get some browning on the meat, which is just going to draw out some additional flavor when you roast these bones before you actually begin your stock making process. It just really adds, so much to it. You're taking the time and the expense to make your stock. You really just want to do it right. And I'm making a really large batch of the stock, so all of those bones, they actually spilled over onto a second sheet tray. You just want to make sure you don't overload your sheet trays. You want to use as many as you can so you get a nice even layer. And just one final note about the bones. You might notice I don't have any marrow bones in this assortment that I'm using. A lot of people use marrow bones. I personally don't like the flavor they impart into the stock. They have almost like a metallic, kind of a bitter flavor. So if you like them, feel free to use them. The recipe still works, but I really recommend that you try it without. I think you're going to like the results. Okay, so the oven is preheated to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. We have very lightly oiled the bones. You'll notice I didn't add any salt and pepper. You don't need to do that at this step. You can if you like, but at this point the oven's ready. I'm just going to very carefully pop this in the oven. Okay, and while you're roasting your bones, this is a perfect time to prep your vegetables. These are eventually going to go in the oven, but they don't take quite as long. So all we want to do is we want to give them a rough chop, and these little end pieces, a lot of times I just kind of remove those, cut those out. And once you've removed the end pieces and everything, you just want to give them a very rough chop. You don't need to cut these into small bits. You just give them a nice rough chop like so. And I'm using carrots, celery, and onions, which is the classic. You can use some different varieties though if you like. You can also use leeks. I would have used leeks today, except they didn't look very nice at the store, so I didn't want to buy them. But you just need anything from the onion family and any other vegetables that you want to use. And then with these garlic cloves, I'm just going to cut them in half, and you don't even need to peel any of the stuff. Okay, so after about 20-25 minutes, here's how we're looking. Now you want to be sure not to get these burnt. You just want to get some color. They should look just like this, and this is when you know you want to flip everything. And once you get everything flipped, you want to go in with some tomato paste. Now what this is going to do, it's going to do a couple things. This is going to add some delicious flavor to the stock, but it's also going to add some acidity. Having the proper level of acidity is very important when you make a stock, because that is going to help you break down the collagen in those bones. So you just want to get that on there and just kind of paint an even coat. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just kind of paint a thin layer. And once you've painted on a thin layer of your tomato paste, you just want to go on and add those vegetables over top. And I'm doing the same thing in both sheet pans, so I'm putting about half and half. But we just want to put these on top. And the reason we're adding these later in the process, these would have burned up if we left them in for the entire time. And a lot of that beef fat has rendered out into the pan. All I'm going to do with that same silicone brush that I use for the tomato paste, I'm just going to paint a little on top of these to prevent them from burning, getting too dry. We didn't use a lot of oil because there's plenty of fat in this. As soon as you start cooking those bones, all that fat's going to render out. So you just want to give everything a light coat. It's going to go back in the oven. And we just repeated that process on the other sheet pan, so I'm going to pop these back into the oven for another 20 or 25 minutes or until everything looks nicely browned. Okay, and here's how we're looking after about 45 minutes in total, about 25 on the first side, 20 minutes on the other side. So at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these pieces off and place them into my stock pot. You can see we got some nice browning, but we didn't burn any of this. Okay, so we've dumped all of those beef bones, beef stew meat, as well as all of those roasted vegetables into a really large stock pot. You want to make sure you use, a large enough stock pot for this. I think this is a 16 quart that I have here. You can always do a smaller batch of the recipe if you like to, but I'm going to go in with some additional red wine. Now we added some tomato paste earlier on in the process, and that was to add some acidity. We're adding some additional acidity. This is just really going to help break down all of that collagen in the bones. It's going to help us extract maximum flavor as well as nutrients. And if you don't want to use red wine, because some people just don't like using alcohol, the other option would be to use cider vinegar. But I like the flavor of red wine a little bit more. And after you've added that red wine, you can go ahead and fill this up with water. You just want to fill it to a little bit above the level of the bones. So we're not going to fill it all the way to the top of the stock pot, but we're using cold filtered water. It's very important to start with cold water. Okay, and you just want to take the water level about to there. It's a couple inches over top. But you don't want to add too much water or you'll reduce the concentration of the stock. So at this point, we've got our cold water in, everything is prepped, and we're ready to go. So I am going to turn this on to high. Now what you want to do, and this is very, very important when you make beef stock or really any type of stock, you never want to let this come to a rolling boil, so we have to watch it. As soon as we start to see some bubbles, we want to turn the heat down, because what we want to do, we want to cook this long and slow over just a very gentle simmer. So again, don't step away. You want to watch this and make sure that it does not boil. Now there's some differing opinions on this next step, but I do like to add a little bit of salt. A lot of people don't add any salt when they make a stock, and that's fine. The reason is a lot of times you're going to be cooking it down and reducing it when you make a pan sauce, as I oftentimes do. So you want to be sure not to let, not to get too carried away with the salt. It can become too concentrated, but I do like to add at least a little bit. That's just going to help serve as a preservative, as you keep it in the fridge or the freezer. And then also, it just adds a little bit, enhances the flavor. I always like to taste things as I cook them, and this, allows me to gauge, how this stock is going to taste. But you want to be sure if you do salt it, only do so very lightly. And while we're on the topic of seasoning, I am going to throw in about a dozen black peppercorns. You can do that at any time, really. So I'm going to put them in there now, and that's just going to impart, a little bit of that peppery flavor into the stock, but you don't want to get carried away. And as we're waiting on our stock to come up to a simmer, I just like to take the temperature, see where I'm at with it. So we're at about, 155 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is going to start to simmer, somewhere in about the 95 range. So you want to check it just so you know you're getting close, because we want to be ready to turn down the heat, right as it's coming up to that simmer. And around this time, as your beef broth, your stock comes up to temperature, as it gets close to that simmer, you're going to notice some bubbles and some impurities at the top. You can just at this point start scraping off, just skimming a little bit. That's mainly fat, and other impurities. So just very gently go in there around the sides and skim off some of that. It's not really going to affect things too much, but it's going to prevent you from getting a cloudier stock. So I'm just going to continue this process until we've removed all of the scum. And that's how we're looking after skimming off as much of that scum as we can. Now I'm going to do that process periodically over the first 30 to 45 minutes. It's going to stop to form. Once you get all of that, that typically forms as the stock is coming up to temperature, but it's not something you have to do constantly throughout the entire time that we simmer this overnight. Okay, and we can see some bubbles there, so I'm going to take a temperature check here. And it looks like we're right at about 193 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, I'm going to just start playing with the heat. I'm going to turn it down a little bit to about medium. And this, it's really going to depend on your stove. I can't tell you exactly what reading your stove should be, but you want to get it right to about, 195, 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to just play around with your temperature until that's going to, hold steady. You don't want to go too much higher than that, because we don't want it to boil. When the stock boils, what that does, there's a lot of fat. There's still a lot of fat that's going to render out of these beef bones and cuts of the beef meat, and you don't want to emulsify that into your stock. So that is the reason why we never take this beyond a gentle simmer. And as those bubbles continue to form, I'm just going to play around with the heat, turning it down even further. I'm a little bit below medium, but again, it might vary with your stove. So that is the perfect level of simmer. You just want the most gentle bubbles popping up, into the surface of your stock, like so. You don't want to take it any bit beyond this, because remember, we added that tomato paste in the red wine for acidity. So that's going to really, really help break down those bones. It's going to help break down the collagen and all that connective tissue. It's going to draw out amazing flavor into the beef stock, and it's also going to draw out some amazing nutrients to make this a very, very healthy addition to your diet. So this really varies. You can let it go as long as you like. I like to let it go overnight. It costs a lot of money buying the beef bones. Takes a lot of time to get this set up, so the longer you let it go, the more flavor and nutrients you're going to extract. I would say the absolute minimum I would ever do would be 6 hours once you bring this to a gentle simmer. But again, that's the minimum. I really like to take it overnight. Some people take it 24 to 48 hours. To me, that's overkill, but you want to let it go as long as you can to just draw out as much as you can from those bones. So we'll check back in a while. Okay, so here we are the next day. I let this go about 21, 22 hours overnight, almost a full 24 hours, not quite. Now you'll notice a couple things. Number one, you'll notice the water level has evaporated quite a bit. We filled a couple inches over top of the bones, and I did that on purpose because you want to make sure that you have everything fully submerged, but you do that knowing that a lot of that water is going to cook off over the span of almost a full day. So that's why we filled it as full as we did. And you'll notice there's a layer of fat here on the top that'll become a little bit more clear later in the process when we go to separate that out. But the stock is also much, much darker. That's due to two reasons. Number one, we evaporated a lot of that water off to concentrate it, but also, we let this go so long, and with the tomato paste and the red wine, that really helped extract as much as we could from these bones. So this is going to be super concentrated, super flavorful. Let me show you a trick now to show you a quick way how to cool this down. So I filled my sink about halfway with cold water and added in ice. Now I would have added even more ice. This was all I had in my freezer, but what we're going to do here, this is so we can bring the beef stock down to room temperature. You don't want to put it into your refrigerator right when it comes off the stove. It's just got so much heat in it, it'll cause your entire refrigerator to get too warm. So this is going to cool it really quickly. And all you want to do is just to very slowly and carefully set that down, like so. You want to make sure the water doesn't come up too high. You don't want it to put it in and have it splash in, so you don't want the water, as tall as the stock pot. So this is only going to take about 15 or 20 minutes. This will get it, close to room temperature. You don't have to get it all the way to room temperature, but this will cause most of that heat, to be absorbed by that ice water. And this is also a good opportunity while you wait. You can begin to skim out the large pieces. So we're going to strain this through a very fine mesh strainer later on, but we want to get rid of all these big pieces first. So I'm just going to fish these out. I'm going to let as much of that drip down as we can. And we're going to take these big parts out. Okay, and here's all of the solids that we have fished out of our bone broth, our beef stock. You have the empty bones along with chunks of meat and vegetables. Now, just one note that I want to make, don't try to cook with this, don't try to reuse it or eat it. It's not going to hurt you or anything, but it's going to be totally bland and flavorless. We've extracted all of the flavor from all of this out into the stock. So you don't want to try to cook with this, just throw it in the trash. Okay, and here is our stock. We fished all of the big pieces out. Now the next step, we want to remove the fat. All of that fat rises to the top, but the easiest way to get rid of it is to put this in the refrigerator, and it's going to, harden up and solidify. We'll be able to scrape that right off. So I'm going to just cover this and pop it in the fridge. Safe to do that. And now that we've brought it down to room temperature, it only took about 15-20 minutes in that ice bath. So I'm going to pop this in the refrigerator and we'll be able to check back in a couple of hours. Okay, so after a couple hours in the fridge, here's what we're left with. You'll notice all of that fat floated to the top. It solidified. You can hear, it makes a sound when you hit it with a knife. It's a solid block, so which is real easy to remove. So what you want to do, you want to go in there and, it kind of breaks off in chunks, but it's real easy just to set that aside. Now, some people like to cook with it. Some people save that, and use it anywhere where you cook with fat. I personally don't, but you can if you like. We used grass-fed beef, so it actually is healthy fat to cook with if you do so. So I'm going to continue to do this off camera until we've removed everything, but you do get a good look. You can see that beef stock, the broth here, it is totally like a jello consistency. That is the mark of a really high quality stock. This tells us that it's going to be really flavorful and it's going to have just a viscosity to it. A nice mouthfeel when we use to make this in a sauce. So I've scraped all the fat off, and just to give you a better look, that is the consistency. So that's really what you're looking for. Okay, so we're almost done. All we need to do now is to strain this out. And since it has solidified so much, we just need to add a small amount of heat. We don't need to bring this up anywhere near to full temperature, but just need to give it a little bit of heat until that liquefies again. And what I'm going to do, we took out all of the big pieces before we, let that sit in the fridge. I'm going to just run this through a fine mesh strainer, and this is going to be ready. So now that the beef stock is back in liquid format, all that we need to do is to strain it out. So I have a really high quality fine mesh strainer. If you don't have one that's really fine, another option is to use a cheesecloth, and you just want to go in there a little bit at a time. I'm not a big fan of taking the stock pot and just dumping it all in. It's just too easy to make a mess. I've made that mistake too many times before. So I just do about a cup at a time, like so. And once we strain it out, we are ready to bottle this up. And once you finish filtering your beef stock, the best way to store this is in these glass jars. So you just want to pour that in carefully like so. And a lot of times I freeze these. They keep for months in the freezer. So you just want to be sure not to fill it all the way to the top. You want to allow a little room for that to expand if you're going to freeze it. And then just put on a tight fitting lid. That's ready to go. Okay, and let me just show you the finished product with our beef stock, also known as bone broth. We've strained everything out through that fine mesh strainer, popped it back into the fridge, and just a couple hours later, we're back to that solid, gelatinous quality. You really want to make sure that you get your stock looking like that. It should not be a liquid when you put it in the refrigerator if you've done it right. We've extracted all of that gelatin, from the bones and the connective tissues, and that's going to give us great nutrients, flavor, but also that mouthfeel, that viscosity. When you make a really good stock, you can use that in your soups or your pan sauces, and it gives it just this thickness and a quality that you can't get with store-bought. You cannot buy this product in the store. It's just not going to be as good as what you homemade. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. I have a couple links in the description box below of me using this stock in my various recipes. I've used it in soups, stews, and my favorite use, pan sauces. So be sure to check the description box for those recipe videos. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you again real soon.